Right, we're going to continue our study of Luke. Today we're going to be looking at Luke chapter 9, verses 18 to 36. So let's look at the first section of this together. Verse 18. And it came about that while he was praying alone, the disciples were with him, and he questioned them, saying, Who did the multitude say that I am? And they answered and said, John the Baptist, and others said, Elijah, but others that one of the prophets of old had risen again. And he said to them, But who do you say that I am? And Peter answered and said, The Christ of God. But he warned them and instructed them not to tell this to anyone. Let's stop there for a moment and let's look at this first section and what is going on here. Now in Luke, this occurs pretty much straight after the feeding of the 5,000. So the disciples and the people had seen him doing this great miracle. Again, a miracle that paralleled what Moses did with the people in the desert by providing manna. And as Jesus asks a very interesting question to them. He asks them, Who did the multitude say that I am? He wants to find out what the disciples think and what the people think. And it's interesting when you look at their response. Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, others say that one of the prophets from of old has risen. Now let's think about this for a moment, even the logic of it. First, John the Baptist. Now, John the Baptist had probably been dead for a year at this stage. He had been executed by Herod. But remember, Jesus was like his second cousin. So they would probably have known each other very well. Jesus and John the Baptist had also been at the Jordan together when Jesus was baptized. So a lot of the followers of John would have seen Jesus and then started to follow Jesus. But they would have known that John the Baptist and Jesus weren't the same person. So confusing Jesus with a risen John the Baptist seems very unusual. But then that's how people work out their faith. They have to figure it out some way. Also, others of them thought it was Elijah, or others thought one of the prophets from of old. Again, it's interesting that they don't see Jesus, in a sense, as in his own right, that he's not a prophet in his own right. He's just someone who's come back from before. So again, it shows how the people were trying to get their head around who Jesus was. And while they knew he worked miracles and they followed him, they still did not get the fact of who he was. It just wasn't part of their thinking yet. Now, Jesus is not too concerned about that. What he wants to know is, what did the disciples think and who did the disciples say he is? So in Luke's gospel, it says that Peter says, You are the Christ of God, or the Messiah. So this is good. Peter has figured out that Jesus is the Messiah. Now what Jesus does is he now, as a result of Peter's belief at that point, he wants to add more revelation to him. And this is typically the way Jesus works, is as soon as we get to a certain point in faith where we trust him with something, he then takes us to the next level. And this is exactly what he's going to do with the disciples. They've now, in a sense, recognized Jesus as the Messiah, but they may have their own idea as to what that means. And probably, if they were typical of the people of the day, they figured the Messiah was going to come, drive out the Romans, liberate Israel, and bring in the kingdom. So now he's going to explain to them what the Messiah's real mission is. So let's read on from verse 22. Verse 22, he says, The Son of Man must suffer many things, and be rejected by the elders and chief priests and the scribes, and be killed, and be raised up on the third day. And he was saying to them, If anyone wishes to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. For whoever wishes to save his life will lose it, but whoever wishes to lose his life for my sake, he is the one who will save it. For what is a man profited if he gains the whole world and forfeits or loses himself? For whoever is ashamed of me and my words, of him will the Son of Man be ashamed when he comes in his glory, and the glory of the Father and of the holy angels. Now let's stop there. Now let's see what Jesus has just told them. And in a sense, he gives them two separate revelations. The first one is where he says, The Son of Man must suffer many things, and be rejected by the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed and be raised up on the third day. So Jesus is describing exactly what will happen to him. He will proclaim himself in a sense the Messiah. He will be rejected. He will be put on trial, and ultimately he will be killed. And he says then on the third day he will rise from the dead. So he is prophesying about the fact that he will rise from the dead. Now this is something they would not have known about, have had no idea at this point. And it's interesting that Jesus introduced himself as the Son of Man, again as a term from the book of Daniel, where the Son of Man is the one who will receive authority from the Father in the future. And so Jesus has told them what is effectively going to happen to him, what his mission is. He will die, but he will rise again from the dead. So they're hearing probably for the first time about the resurrection. But given that revelation of who Jesus is and that he is going to rise from the dead, there is then a challenge in following him. So Jesus talks about the idea that if anyone wants to follow him, he must deny himself. But then he goes on and gives him a further revelation. It's not just that Jesus will rise from the dead and return to heaven, but he says someday he will come back. And so in verse 26 he says, when the Son of Man comes in his glory and the glory of the Father and of the holy angels. And this is prophetic, we call messianic prophetic, that Jesus will come back ultimately to rule the earth, but he will come back with the Father and with the angels. Again, this is a revelation that is new to them, but again, if they were familiar with the Old Testament, there is a similar passage in Daniel where Daniel prophesies and he has a vision where he sees a Son of Man taking authority from the Father to rule the earth. So Jesus is applying this to himself, calling himself the Son of Man. Again, this is a huge revelation. This effectively is like the full picture. Jesus will come to earth as Messiah. He will do his miracles. He'll be rejected, killed. He will be risen from the dead, go to heaven, and ultimately he will return in what we call the second coming of Christ, where he returns to rule on the earth. Again, this is a huge revelation for the disciples. And again, this is typical of Jesus, is that once they've got one thing in their heads, which is that he's the Messiah, he then builds upon that and gives them more revelation. Now, I'm sure at this point they're kind of wrestling with this idea of who is this Jesus then? So then we get into the next section, which is the transfiguration. So again, this is another revelation. So he is bringing revelation to the disciples to get them ready. So let's look at the transfiguration, which is verses 26 and follows. Sorry, I should say verse 28. And some 8 days after these sayings, it came about that he took along Peter and John and James and went up to the mountain to pray. And while he was praying, the appearance of his face became different, and his clothing became white and gleaming. And behold, 2 men were talking with him, and they were Moses and Elijah, who appearing in glory were speaking of his departure which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Now Peter and his companions had been overcome with sleep, but when they were fully awake, they saw his glory and the 2 men standing with him. And it came about, as these were parting from him, Peter said to Jesus, Master, it is good for us to be here, and let us make 3 tabernacles, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah, not realizing what he was saying. And while he was saying this, a cloud formed and began to overshadow them, and they were afraid as they entered the cloud. And a voice came out of the cloud saying, This is my Son, my chosen one, listen to him. And when the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone. And they kept silent and reported to no one in those days any of the things which they had seen. So here again, the transfiguration. This is again a very unusual passage in that we don't have a parallel to it later on in the Gospels. But Jesus goes up and he takes us Peter and James and John, and they go up to the mountain to pray. And this seems to be a kind of a typical thing that they did. And another typical thing about praying is that the disciples usually fall asleep. They did the same in the garden later on. So if you ever find yourself falling asleep at a prayer meeting, don't get too concerned about it. It seems to be the way to go. So Peter and James and John are there, and while Jesus is praying, his whole appearance changes. His face becomes different, his clothing becomes white and gleaming, and 2 men end up talking to him, and they are Moses and Elijah. Now, we're not told how we know they're Moses and Elijah, or how Peter and the other two will recognize them as Moses and Elijah. We just have to take it that somehow they do. So you imagine the scene is that Jesus has changed. Moses and Elijah appear with him, and they appear in glory. So they are appearing literally as they will be in heaven. And it's like the three of them, as if heaven has opened up and you see Jesus in his natural setting, which is heaven. And they're talking about what he's going to accomplish at Jerusalem, or his departure at Jerusalem. So they were talking about, obviously, his death and his resurrection. And the disciples who have been asleep are now waking up, and they start to see this. And eventually they're, you could say, fully awake. And at this point, the two men leave, Moses and Elijah, effectively disappear, and Jesus is left there on his own. And I'm sure this, for the disciples, is they're trying to get their heads around this. And the great thing is Peter comes out with this great statement that it's great we are here because we can build 3 tabernacles for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah, and one for Jesus. And the commentary says, not realizing what he was saying. He just kind of talking without, you could say, engaging his brain at this point, because he's probably in shock. He's never seen anything like this before. Again, it's another revelation of Jesus that they're trying to get their hands around. And then it follows on in verse 34. Another thing happens. A cloud forms around them. Again, this cloud is very similar to what would have happened with Moses when he went up to get a revelation from God on the mountain. It often talked about the cloud descending upon the mountain, and that's how God communicated. And I'm sure Luke has this probably in mind. But they're all encompassed by this cloud. They become afraid. So it's not just, I think, a normal cloud blowing in, just like because they're on a high mountain and there happens to be clouds. I've been in Israel and I've been to the same area, and you don't really get too many low-lying clouds in that area of the world. And if they are, it's very light. So I think this is more than just a standard rain cloud. This is God's presence, God arriving on the scene, and just like in the Old Testament, he enters on a cloud. And that probably explains why they were afraid. And a voice comes out of the cloud and says, "This is my son, my chosen one, listen to him." Again, another direct revelation, this time from God, about Jesus, calling him his son and telling the disciples to listen to him. And that is kind of interesting because they've just seen this vision of Jesus as if he were in heaven. They've seen Moses and Elijah with him, conversing with him. And so again, that's a revelation of Jesus as the Messiah and probably reflecting his future glory. And then God comes in effect, when he tells the disciples, look, this is my son, please listen to him. Do what he says. Take what he says seriously. And again, God is confirming testimony on behalf of Jesus. And then the scene finishes, and when the voice had finished, Jesus is found alone. So literally everything returns back to normal. So there are the disciples now on the mountain with Jesus. The cloud is gone. The Moses and Elijah are gone. Jesus is back to normal. And they keep silent and they say nothing about this to anybody. At least it says in those days they said nothing. It will be later on after the resurrection they will talk about this. But again, it's interesting that they are probably in shock. They don't know what to do with this. They don't know where to put this. Like, you've just been told that the Jesus, this Messiah you're following, is going to go to Jerusalem, will die, be risen from the dead, will return in glory. And you've seen him talking to Moses and Elijah. That's a lot to take in the one go. And they don't know what to do about it. But what's interesting is that in the passage, they're not criticized for this. There's no negative comment as Luke goes on in his story. Then goes to the next story where they end up, Jesus has to cast out a demon out of a man who is possessed by a demon. But there's no reflection back to the disciples, nothing critical is said. And again, I think this is good because what it says is when we get a revelation of Jesus through maybe reading scripture, we realize something. Sometimes it takes a long time to settle that into our heads and get it into our hearts. And Jesus is very patient with the disciples. He doesn't rebuke them for not taking this on board. He allows this to kind of sink into them. it will probably be another year by the time he ends up going to Jerusalem. It'll be certainly a few months forward before everything happens, and finally, you could say the penny drops at after the resurrection and probably after Pentecost. And I think we can take it that God deals with us in pretty much the same way. We learn things about God, about Jesus, and it does take us a while to get that into our system. You could say to first acknowledge it mentally and then to get it into our hearts. So this passage kind of helps us understand who Jesus is, but it also gives us that time to absorb. Learn to hear about Jesus. Again, we see the way he communicates himself to the disciples, tells them who he is, tells them what his mission is, and then allows them to see him in glory. And then it's like he allows that time for that to be absorbed. And I think we can take the same in our own lives. As we learn more about Jesus through studying scripture, we can allow ourselves that time for it to be absorbed and to learn and to really take it to heart. And again, at the end, the challenge Jesus gives to the disciples, having seen this revelation, is he wants them to follow him. He says, what will it profit you if you gain the whole world and lost your soul or forfeited yourself? And he tells them that really learning who you are, finding out what your real true life is about effectively knowing Jesus and believing in him. And maybe that's the thing we can take away from this passage, is what is our core belief about Jesus, and then what are we going to do about it? Are we going to choose to follow him, or are we going to choose just to get absorbed in life? And so our prayer should be that we would ultimately follow Jesus. Father, thank you for revealing yourself, for showing who you are, and in this passage revealing who you really are as you stood there effectively in heaven with Moses and Elijah. Help us to believe that this is true, and help us when we think about you, not just to think about you when you are on earth, but to think about who you are today in heaven and how you're going to come in the future in glory. And we certainly want that when you come in glory in the future and we meet you, that we would want you to be proud of us. Help us all to believe who you truly are.